Okay, that's great. Good to see you, Ryan. Okay, so today Jon will lead off talking about Ball 4 turns 40. Then we will have Justin McKinney talking about Californians in the Union Association. We'll take a quick trivia break. And then Dan Taylor will talk about Kenny Washington. So let me introduce Jon, who you all know anyway. Jon is a documentary filmmaker who attended the Baseball Reliquary's legendary celebration of Jim Bouton's iconic book on the occasion of its 40th anniversary. They had a 6-hour symposium featuring a panel discussion on the book's cultural impact, the world premiere of a documentary on the Seattle Pilots, and panel discussion with Jim Bouton, Tommy Davis, Greg Goossen, and filmmaker Ron Shelton. Okay, Jon, take it away.
Thank you, Barry. I'm going to share my screen with everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Go. Let me get my get this guy full screen here. Oops. Can you see the slideshow here? Let me see. Let me go full screen. And I'm sorry for the delay here. You know what? I'm just going to leave it like this to keep things simple so I don't tempt fate. Welcome. I make baseball documentaries about the human side of the game, the stories beyond the stats, if you will. And this fuels a multimedia project I have called The Sweet Spot, which I started in 2016. And the mission of that project is to look at the national pastime from a perspective that is humanistic, iconoclastic, and academic. Along with human stories, we also examine social issues like race and gender in the national pastime. I've made films about Arnold Haino, Mudcat Grant, Jackie Robinson, Ernie Banks, women from the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, the 1989 World Series Earthquake, and the Baseball Reliquary. My films are available on Amazon Prime, on the show called The Sweet Spot there. We're also on Vimeo, and The Sweet Spot has a page on Patreon, and which some of you participate on. And 10 of my films are in the Hall of Fame's permanent collection. We have a book available as well on Amazon called Baseball Pioneers, True Stories of Guts and Glory as told by the men and women of the game. We also have a set of custom trading cards featuring folks like umpire Perry Barber, pitcher Isla Borders, and tops photographer Doug McWilliams. I want to talk now. I'm a big, huge fan of Jim Bouton and Ball 4. I bought it the first day it was available in the summer of 1970 when I was 12 years old, and it remains one of my favorite books. I've been a member of the Baseball Reliquary since 2003, and in 2009, I realized 2010 would be the 40th anniversary of Ball 4. So I suggested to Reliquary leader Terry Cannon to have a day to celebrate the book on its 40th anniversary, and he loved the idea. And he spent a year putting together an amazing program. And next slide here, go down to it. The Los Angeles Times did an article promoting the event a few days beforehand. Consequently, it was absolutely mobbed. This was the Burbank Central Library, and the room held about 175. There were at least 200 there, and there were people 4 deep in the doorway looking in. And so Jim Bouton was flown out to participate, and he was joined by former Pilots teammates Greg Goossen and Tommy Davis. There was a panel discussion about the book's cultural impact with filmmaker Ron Shelton, author Gene Hastings Ardell, and David Kippen, the former director of literature for the National Endowment for the Arts. And the event was moderated by author David Davis. The event also featured the world premiere of the Seattle Pilots documentary, and the lobby of the library glittered with gold from Charles Kapner's world-class collection of Seattle Pilots relics and artifacts. And as Barry mentioned, the event ran an astonishing 6 hours. We started at 11 and ended at 5. There aren't many things people like to do that last 6 hours, but everybody stayed and everybody loved it. And it concluded with a book signing with Tommy Davis, Greg Goossen, Gene Ardell, and Jim. So as I mentioned earlier, the book is it was certainly a personal journey for me, from a baseball crazed kid reading and learning about things like voyeurism, illegal pet pills, skirt chasing, and paternity suits. But Bouton's book brought my baseball cards to life as dimensional, funny, flawed people who had struggles just like the rest of us. I'm Glad You Didn't Take It Personally, the follow-up to Ball 4, as well as the 20th anniversary edition. And I was able to meet Jim the night before the event and share dinner with him, Terry, and Mary Cannon. And he was, smart, personable, funny, and friendly. And things came full circle 4 years after the event. In 2014, Jim put out the last edition of the book, the final pitch, and there was a new chapter that he had included about the Baseball Reliquary in it. And he was kind enough to give me a shout out. So it really brought things full circle for me from this wide-eyed 12-year-old kid to actually ending up in the book. So making the film, I thought making a documentary celebrating the book might be celebrating book, which was, it's hard to know which baseball book has sold more books than any other. Ball 4 has sold somewhere between 5 and 6 million copies. The Wall Street Journal has backed that up. And so I thought that there would be, and certainly there would be an audience for the book. So I was at the event, and the reason I was there was I was covering a year in the life of the Baseball Reliquary. And I made a film, it's called Not Exactly Cooperstown. It came out in 2012, but we were covering all the events they did in 2010. And the Ball 4 turns 40 event was one of them. But I just put a little slice of it in there because it's got a bunch of other stuff in there that the Reliquary put on that year. So I came back to it because I said, this was such an amazing event, and Ball 4 is such a book with a lot of meaning and interest in baseball circles. So I said, let's make this film. And it was quite a challenging project because a lot of the material was shot. I had no budget when I was making it. So I had borrowed equipment from all of my friends. I've been a producer in the entertainment industry for over 30 years now. So I have lots of friends and we all help each other out in any way that we can. And so I was borrowing cameras, but they were standard definition cameras. So they were not high def to what we're all used to today. So we had some challenges relative to that, which I'll share with you in a minute. So they took about a year. I started working on this last November, and to get everything edited and to do voiceover recording, bringing in voice actors and doing additional filming of tableaus for the insert shots. As I mentioned, one of the big challenges was, trying to, there's an example of a tableau shot. A wonderful artist, Arthur K. Miller, gave me permission to use his portrait of Jim Bouton there. So I try to utilize a lot of resources from people that I know. I have a lot of old baseball memorabilia and ephemera that I get from an art director and an artist named Greg Jazuski, who's a good friend of mine. So I'll get a lot of props from him that will help me prop these things out. And here, where are we going here? That's number 16. As I said, so the biggest challenge I was really worried. So you can see the before picture. This is this standard definition video. And I was really worried that audiences today, they're so used to seeing 4K video. They're used to seeing stuff that's shot in high def. And this really had a little bit of a quality issue to it. And we tried a lot of different solutions for it. But what we came up with was putting inside of the bezel of a television set from 1970, the year that the book came out. And it sort of adds a nostalgic charm, if you will. And so many of the people who have seen the film said, I really liked that little callback to 1970. So basically we took a bug and made it a feature. And I think that, what slide is this here? Number 18. What makes the book so strong is Bouton's unique perspective as a marginal player on an expansion team that's stocked with misfits. He went from being a supernova, winning 39 games in 2 years, along with a couple of World Series wins, to blowing out his arm and trying to survive with a notoriously difficult pitch to master the knuckleball, all while navigating life for him and his family while desperately hanging on to the game that he loves. I should also mention that support from the project came from SABR. They provided photos of the SABR 47 event in New York. Author Mitchell Nathanson, who wrote the biography of Jim Bouton, was very helpful. The Hall of Fame allowed me to license some images from them. The Baseball Reliquary was very instrumental in this project. Jim's son, Michael Bouton, was very helpful, as well as the filmmaker Ron Shelton, who's been really supportive of the project. Not just back in 2010, but I got back in touch with him again, and I said, look, I'm doing this thing. I would love to have you involved in it again. And he was extremely supportive. Let's see, I've got some clips to show here. Let's see if we can call. So I'm going to show you the trailer. Let me call that up. Go full screen. And here we go.
This is something different. I mean, who thinks of bringing in Jim Bouton and Tommy Davis and Greg Goossen and all these people that the average fan would be like, huh, who, what? But the baseball fan, the real fan's like, oh, wow.
I can hardly believe it, when I think back. At the time I was keeping these notes, the idea that one day, years later, 40 years later, somebody would be still talking about the book. So they figured I was just going to write a regular sports book. I got a big game tomorrow, and I sure hope Gary's feeling well, because we really need this win, and we've lost 3 in a row, and we got to go get him. I was actually writing about Fred Talbot and Merritt Renew arguing about which part of the South was dumber.
It's just the oddest set of circumstances in the world. I mean, what team is around one lousy year? I mean, a Little League team is longer than that. I mean, this was the big leagues.
That's the strangest year I've ever had in my life. Really?
In terms of in the clubhouse, how prevalent were greenies back in, late 60s, early 70s in the game?
I could use a couple right now.
Oh, Harry Walker is the one who manages this crew. He doesn't like it when we drink and fight and smoke and screw.
And there's the website. It's patreon.com / The Sweet Spot TV if you'd like to watch the film. Let's see. Barry, do I have time to show 1 2-minute clip, or do we have to move on?
Yeah, make it quick, please.
You know what? I'll just go ahead, and if anybody's got any questions, we can do that instead. Oh, and I'll stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Okay. Yeah. Any questions? Go right ahead. Any questions for Jon?
No questions. That's how you got Nixon.
How long is the film, Jon?
It's 60 minutes.
And I don't know, I've not used Patreon before, so you go to the website and stream it from there?
Yes, when you go to Patreon, my Patreon page, patreon.com / The Sweet Spot TV. You'll see you'll just scroll down to the very first post that says, welcome Ball 4 fans. And Patreon it's a subscription service, just like Netflix or Hulu. To watch the film, it's $8. There's 3 different tiers. You want to go to the $8 tier. And once you pay, you're able to, it'll show you a link to go to click on to watch the movie. You can unsubscribe at any time. For example, like Ryan here is one of my members, and he's a sustaining member. He participates every month. But that's how you watch it, That's how one would watch it, Marlene.
Is it also on Prime?
No,
No.
not at this time.
But Sweet Spot is on Prime still.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
We have season 3, which is all about women in baseball.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
John, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I wish I could stay with you, but I got to go back to work. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank
Okay.
you, John.
Cheers.
All right,
Thanks.
Justin McKinney is here. Justin has written Baseball's Union Association, The Strange Short Life of an Early Major League. And here's the book. And Justin is going to talk about the connection with Californians. The Californian-born players who appeared in the Union Association in 1884, including the lowly Washington Nationals, who featured 5 California natives. Justin, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, I'll get started. I'm just gonna open up my thing and then share my screen. So just give me a moment. Okay. Right, and it's showing up for everyone. Okay, so I'll get started. So yeah, California and the Union Association. Background for the Union Association is that it was formed in fall 1883 with the intention there'd be an 8-team circuit. They made the stated intention that they would ignore the reserve rule, which was in place where teams could, in the American Association, National League, and Northwestern League, had agreed that they could each reserve 10 players on the roster for the coming season. And essentially the Union Association being formed, to rival that. And essentially they're going to look for players wherever they can, and that includes, reserve players if necessary. And so to start the 1884 season, there were 28 teams across 3 major leagues, and there were numerous minor leagues. So it's fair to say that in 1884, there's more professional baseball teams than there ever had been in history to that point. This increased number of teams led to an increased demand for players and a pressure to find diamonds in the rough, or at the very least warm bodies. So there's brief history of Californians in the big leagues. Robert Stevens and Tom Ogan were the first California natives to play in the majors, in the National Association, which I know some people don't consider a major league, but I personally do. So yeah, they're kind of the pioneers, so to speak. And then Andy Piercy, who's a well-known player who played a bunch of the California leagues in the 1870s and 1880s. He makes 2 appearances for the Chicago White Stockings in 1881, so making him the first Californian to appear in the National League. And then Jerry Denny becomes kind of the first regular player, star player with California connections. He joined Providence, and he's a St. Mary's College alumni. And then Denny is joined by Sandy Nava and Charlie Sweeney in Providence in 1882. And that same year, also with the American Association forming, the Philadelphia Athletics also include Bob Blakeston and a guy named Hartford Jack Farrell, who's an Eastern player who had spent the last few years playing in California. And so, that's sort of the genesis of sort of Californians kind of entering into Major League Baseball. Here's some photos. So there's Robert Stevens on the far left. He's the first one to appear in a Major League game. Andy Piercy, and then Jerry Denny, who would go on to a long career into the 1890s. I believe he was the last position player not to use a glove. And then, so the question is, why California? Why Californians coming east? Well, essentially, California teams had proliferated in the late 1870s. There's started to be some competitive leagues, typically based in San Francisco and LA. And then Eastern pros had also started to go west in the offseason to play for local teams to make some extra money, etc. And then in the late 1870s, early 1880s, baseball was going through this rapid growth period with the expansion of the National League, the creation of the American Association, and the formations of these dozen minor league teams, which leads us to 1884. And then the demand for players increased. And I think also that the networking opportunities increased as players from the East would then recommend that players from California come out east to join their teams, etc. So it just becomes a thing where there's much more familiarity. I expect also the improvement of train travel across the country and that sort of stuff had really led to just this increased opportunities for Californians to come east to play ball. And so oddly enough, Reading, Pennsylvania becomes this interesting hub for Californians, and particularly folks in the San Francisco area. Basically in 1881, Ed Morris, who was Brooklyn born but California raised, came east at the suggestion of Johnny Ward, the famed Johnny Ward, who was the star player for Providence and later went on to found the Players League. He joined Philadelphia, the League Alliance, in 1882, which is the precursor of the Philadelphia Phillies. But he soon joined the Reading Active semi-pro club, and he recruited a guy named Henry Moore, who was a former teammate from California. And so for the 1883 season, Reading's playing in organized ball in the Interstate Association, which is kind of a low to mid-level minor league. Morris and Moore are on the club, and then they're soon joined by catcher Fred Curl, who is a teenager at that point. I think he's about 18 years old. He came east to play for Reading. And the club was riddled by dissension, with the California trio blamed for much of the club's problems. I found this one quote that I thought was funny, that Morris made the remark that he would have a California 9 here before long. So it's this idea that, the Californians are coming east to take our jobs. I thought that was a fascinating insight into 1883. Here's some photos of Ed Morris on the left and Fred Curl on the right. So Morris was the pitcher and Curl was the catcher, and they stuck together for quite some time through the 1880s, became maybe one of the best batteries in baseball. And then we go from Reading to Washington. So Morris and Curl, they signed with Columbus of the American Association for 1884, and they kind of ascend to Major League stardom. Curl, in fact, is probably one of the best catchers of the 19th century and was a really good hitter as well as a good defensive catcher. And then Morris was a predominant pitcher for about 4 or 5 seasons. And in the usual fashion, I think ended up with a lot of troubles just because going 400 or 500 innings a year is not very sustainable. And then that leads us to Reading signed 3 more California players, like a guy named Charlie Gagas, Pete Megan, and John Collin for 1884. And Henry Moore, who had played for Reading, he signs with Washington, and he's joined on the opening day roster by a highly touted teenage catcher named Mike Cregan, who was another former teammate from California. Cregan didn't last very long, but Moore proved to be the best player on the Washington Nationals in the Union Association. So Moore's Law. So Moore was a talented, troubled, and charismatic player who sort of alternate between antagonizing his teammates and winning them over in equal measure. He's a very talented guy, and I guess he had a lot of ability to talk his way in and out of situations, and sort of was not the most reliable person, but somehow kept getting opportunities because I think he was able to show contrition at the appropriate time and get back in people's good graces. Washington manager Mike Scanlon, he in 1884, he basically ran the team on the cheap. They had probably the lowest payroll in baseball, and they used 51 players at a time when most teams were carrying, went through 10 to 15 players in a season. And so he just was looking for anyone who could play ball. And as long as they came cheap, he was willing to give them a shot. And so it seemed likely that Moore recommended a bunch of his old teammates. So 3 more Californians appeared for Nationals in 1884. So we got William McLaughlin, Jim McDonald, and then Charlie Gagas. McDonald and Gagas were both former teammates of Moore as well. So it's just, you really get a sense of these connections between, one guy is recommending his old teammates to come over and play, and they get opportunities, and it's sort of just like, it's very much word of mouth, because in the days before internet, you send telegrams, for telephone, you send a telegram, maybe, it's all these like personal connections are how people got jobs and how people found opportunities and how people got discovered. There wasn't really a scouting network at the time. It was just kind of, I went and saw this guy play, and I played against this guy, he's a good guy, and then you recommend him and he comes over. And so here's a nice photo of Henry Moore. So yeah, he hit 336 for Washington in the Union Association. He never appeared in another major league game. He was troubled and enigmatic. He got in continual fights with teammates and management. He played for Washington in the Eastern League because after the 1884 season, when the Union Association folded, the Washington club actually moved to the Eastern League. And then that club eventually ends up in the National League in 1886. And they went back to California and played for 7 more years. For over a century, he was probably the most sought after mystery player. One of my pet hobbies is trying to track down death dates and biographical details for some of the most obscure players, which is a big reason why I ended up writing this book. And so Moore was probably at the top of the list for most baseball researchers who are in that field. But finally, in 2015, it was discovered that he died in San Francisco at 1902 at age 40. And here's an anecdote that I think sums up Moore's baseball life. Prior to the August 15th, 1884 game against the Boston Unions in Boston, he was denied a $10 advance by his management. So with Washington down 3-2 in the bottom of the ninth, the runners on first and third, his teammate Bill Wise recounted what happened next. He walked up to the plate, smacked the first ball pitched into the far corner of the lot, good for twice 4 bases. So basically a home run in any shape or form. He threw his hat on the ground and deliberately walked to the players' bench and sat down. Baker and I, that's the captain of the team, both raced to the plate, but the Boston fielder finally overtook the ball and fielded it to first base, and then probably declared Moore out. Neither run counting under the rule, Boston winning the game 3-2. So I generally believe this story is probably apocryphal. I found the one game where it could have happened, and there was runners on first and third in the bottom of the ninth for Washington. They were down by 1 run. But the Boston scholars make no mention of this story. The story appears maybe 20 years later. So there's reasonable chances it's apocryphal, but it also gets at like, this is the kind of guy that he was perceived to be. And then the follow-up to the story is that he's able to talk his way back onto the team. Like, it's just not really a big deal because it's just like, oh, that's Henry being Henry. He's just like, he's moody or whatever. And so that's how you just get the sense of this kind of guy. So here's his other teammate on opening day for Washington. He was a highly touted coach for his defensive abilities. He debuted at 19, but he was not as good as advertised. He hit just 152. He only made 3 appearances as a catcher, and he had 14 pass balls, which even by the standards of the time is just exceptionally terrible, because although catchers weren't using gloves at that point, the best catchers in the league were still, able to stop the ball on a regular basis. So for that many pass balls in 3 games is just awful for the era. He only made 9 appearances. He ends up actually going to Reading in May 1884, and then goes back to California. They died in 1924. Here's the third player who appeared for the Nationals from California. It's William McLaughlin. He was a shortstop from San Francisco, and he was likely recommended by Moore, although they weren't actually teammates in California. He made 10 games. He appeared in 10 games. Then he asked for his release while the club was traveling to Chicago, and he ended up going to the minors and playing in California the rest of his career. And he died at age 74 in 1936. And Charlie Gagas, I think it's a really interesting character and a surprisingly talented player who never really got another shot, but he was the St. Mary's College alumni, which is, if you don't know about St. Mary's College from California, it was the hub of, there's so many players who came out of there, studied with Jerry Denny, and then there's another 7 or 8 who came from there in the 1880s, and then Harry Hooper, the Hall of Famer for the Boston Red Sox, he came out of there, and even Tony Gonsolin, who pitches for the Dodgers, he's an alumni of St. Mary's College, so I find it very fascinating that this school that's relatively small, obscure, from California has been producing major league talent since the 1870s. I think that's really neat. So he began the season in Reading. He signed with Washington in August 1884, and he actually proves to be one of the best players on the club. He was a really talented pitcher. In his first appearance at pitcher, he actually made an appearance at shortstop before his first pitching start. He struck out 14 batters, which at the time would have been a record for a rookie pitcher. And then he pitched a no-hitter in his 5th or 6th major league start against Wilmington. The game was called after 8 innings. He with Washington up 12-1. So yeah, he went 10-9. He had a 2.54 ERA, a 1.19 ERA plus, and 154 strikeouts and 177 innings pitched. Then he played for Washington in the Eastern League, and then he just eventually went back west and never played in the majors again. And he died in 1917 at age 54. But he really made a difference. Washington was one of the worst clubs in the league, and then once he joined, they actually became kind of mediocre. They were like out of 500 the rest of the season once he joined the club. Jim McDonald, he was another guy. He had signed with Reading for 1884, but he ended up jumping to Pittsburgh of the American Association. He played 38 games though, but he really struggled, hit only 159, and they made 2 kind of token appearances for Washington in October of 1884, and then he stayed east, played 5 more major league games for Buffalo in the National League, and then he goes back to California, and he died at age 54 in 1914. And now we move on to non-nationals. So that was the 5 players who played for the Nationals. Then we have probably the best of the lot of any Californian who came to the majors and appeared in the Union Association most definitely. It's a guy named Charlie Sweeney, which I expect if you know anything about 19th century baseball, you've come across his name. He was a talented but incredibly tumultuous star for Providence. He shared pitching duties with old Hoss Radbourn. He set a major league record for strikeouts on June 7th, 1884, with 19 strikeouts. And then, he feuded with Radbourn. This is the year Radbourn won 59 games and led his team to the pennant. And so eventually he ends up quitting the team, where he's suspended on July 22nd, 1884. He jumped to the Union Association. He signed a contract with the league leading St. Louis Maroons for a reported 3-year, $8,000 contract. He went 41-15 with 170 ERA and in nearly 500 innings pitched. He injured his arm in 1885. He was never effective again. He was also kind of what you'd call a cancer. He got in fights with teammates. He antagonized people. He was a really tough person to deal with. And I'll get into the story of how he leaves Providence in a moment. And yeah, he eventually went to California. He got in trouble with the law. He became a police officer, but also was involved with gangsters. He ended up going to prison on a murder charge, and then he died, I believe, of tuberculosis in 1902 at age 38. And he's kind of becomes like this symbolic figure for kind of wasted talent and sort of the dangers of dissipation and fast living. And so he's a very interesting guy, but not a good guy, so to speak. And then another guy who appears in the Union Association, this guy Jack Cullen. He also is called Rusty. He's also, he was a very well-known figure in California. He was born in New Orleans, but he grew up in California. He was reputedly one of the finest players in the state, the Golden State. He came out east to play with the Guardian Actives in 1884, and they joined Wilmington of the Eastern League after getting disbanded, and then Wilmington is recruited to join the Union Association a few weeks later. He played 9 games for Wilmington. He hit 194, and then his season ended when he fell down in a darkened elevator shaft. He nearly died, but he ended up being okay. Played a few more years in the minors, and then went back to California. And you can find some of anecdotes of him talking about old California ball, like the 1910s and stuff like that. He sort of became this kind of like beloved figure for old-time baseball in California. And he died at 66 in 1921. And then finally, Jim McElroy. I don't have a photo of him. If anyone does have a photo of him, I'd be much obliged to see it. He was another St. Mary's College alumni. He came out east to play for Baltimore in the Eastern League, but Baltimore folded, and he was signed by the Philadelphia Phillies. He was absolutely terrible as a pitcher. Maybe he just needed more seasoning, but he just 1-12. He had a 4.86 ERA, which doesn't seem that bad, but he had 54 walks and 46 wild pitches in 111 innings. And this is a time when it took 7 balls to walk a person. So that's an exceptional lack of control. And so after he's released by Philadelphia, he gets signed by Wilmington. They give him a trial as pitcher. He gets shelled in his only appearance. He played out east in 1885, and then he returned to California. And then just a couple years later, he died of a morphine overdose in the aptly named Needles, California, at age 26. And so I think not much is known about him other than these kind of details, but I'd love to track down a photo of him, because that's one of my also projects, is to find a photo of every major league player. It's something I do along with the SABR Pictorial History Committee. And so McElroy's involved in a couple interesting things with pitchers named Charlie. So on July 22nd, McElroy, he faces off against Charlie Sweeney. And it's the first ever matchup of California-born pitchers. It's a controversial game, and this is where Sweeney ends up leaving the club. I think the 7th inning, Sweeney refuses to leave the pitcher's box to rest his tired right arm. The club is up 6-2, and Philadelphia is one of the worst teams in the league, and Providence is in the pennant race. So he refuses to leave the box, and then gets in an altercation with his manager, Frank Bancroft, and then he quits the team. And they go to spend the rest of the game in the outfield stands with 2 ladies of ill repute. And then Providence is forced to finish the game with 8 players, and they blow this 6-2 lead and they lose 10-6. And Sweeney's the whole time is watching the game and just like mocking his teammates, and his like it's one of the most sociopathic stories I've ever come across on the ball field. And this ends up being Jim McElroy's only major league victory. And then less than a month later, it was August 21st, not August 22nd, but he is facing off against Charlie Gagas, and this is the second ever matchup of California-born pitchers. McElroy loses 12-1, shows absolutely nothing, and then Gagas pitched a no-hitter in that game, and so it's just, you know, his two matches against California Charlies. He had some interesting things happen. So. The California League, in addition to the California World players and that influence, there's also the California League and the alumni who appear in the Union Association. So aside from the Californians, there were 7, possibly 8 players who appeared in the California League who also made appearances in the Union Association. So it's Jack Lilly, Fergie Malone, Bill Sweeney, Tom Dolan, Billy Taylor, Fred Lewis, the only Nolan, and then this guy named Bill McCloskey, who was a catcher for Wilmington. There's a player named McCloskey who's playing in the California League in the 1879, 1880, but I just haven't been able to confirm it's the same guy, but it could possibly be him. So, so it just shows kind of this influence of as the demand for talent increases, everyone's looking to other places to try and find anyone who can play. And the Union Association, especially, certain clubs are just desperate for talent because there's so little available talent. Because between the National League, American Association, and the Northwestern League, a ton of that talent was reserved, and then all the other leagues are basically against the Union Association. Like, they have no relationship with any other league. They're kind of seen as the outsider, and players are threatened with blacklisting if they sign with the Union Association. And so there's just a real fight to try and find any sort of players. And so that's why you start looking to California and these different connections to find people. So in conclusion, 1881 to 1884 saw this influx of Californians to the major leagues. Networking was super important to this sort of happening. Jerry Denny, Ed Morris, and Henry Moore were seen to be key recruiters in bringing people east. Providence and Reading were sort of pioneers in the willingness to employ California players. And then the Washington Nationals set a record at that point with 5 Californians on the roster in 1884. And then the expansion of leagues and its demand for players kind of leads to that recruitment. And so that wraps up this talk. I do have a book out. It officially came out, I think, at the end of October, but it's available in physical form. We're also on Kindle. So makes a wonderful gift for the Union Association fans in your life. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions or any comments or anything like that. So.
Justin, was Henry, we have a question here. Does Henry Moore's problem involve alcohol at all?
I expect there's probably elements of that, but it wasn't, the stuff I've read about him, it doesn't seem like that was the deal that was causing so much tumult. I think he just had this prickly, complicated personality. I'm sure there was alcohol probably in some of that, but he didn't have this reputation as like this debaucherous guy. Like, that wasn't the strictly, where some guys, everything you read about them, they mentioned how much they were drinking. But with him, it seems more like his personality was just difficult.
Okay. Dave Nemec's on the phone. Dave, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah. In your research, I couldn't hear all your speech, unfortunately. I'm on a phone with Barry. What did you come across about Jim McElroy?
Yeah, so it's essentially just like that he had come west as after from California. He was a St. Mary's College pitcher, and then essentially he, his struggles in out east, I think goes back west, and then sort of just a couple years later he dies from morphine overdose. So I'm not sure if that was an intentional overdose or if it was accidental. But yeah, like it's sort of like just like there's not too much written about him other than just like little odd mentions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Who accompanied him?
Unfortunately, I couldn't hear all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Were you able to ascertain which way he threw, left or right?
No, I wasn't able to come across that. Yeah, I didn't find any mentions.
He has the all-time record for most wild pitches per 9 innings of anybody who threw a minimum of 200 innings in Major League competition, or even 100 innings in Major League.
Yeah, I think he's just over 100. Yeah.
And his win came in an incredibly weird game with Providence, where Providence ended up with only 8 players on the
he did
field.
talk about that, Dave.
He did talk about that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And and other than that, if it hadn't been for that win, he would have preceded Terry Feldman as the only pitcher with most losses without a win.
Oh, that's neat. Yeah. I guess that makes sense.
He would have been 0-14.
Yeah.
Did you find any updates to, they're not posted yet in Bill Carl's website?
Oh, well, yeah, I do a lot of stuff with Bill on all this sort of stuff. He's a great guy. And so I've worked with him on a bunch of these kind of stuff.
Any name changes that Bill hasn't listed yet?
Not in the last couple of months, but we've done a lot of stuff. So the Washington Nationals became kind of my gateway into this, because they have all these kind of obscure players who were unfound. So we don't have the first names for them. We don't know anything about them. I've spent a lot of time. There's one guy I found who actually had never been credited with a major league game, and he actually I ended up finding this guy as part of this research. So he's a new major leaguer named Thomas Tinney. So I work with Bill a lot on that stuff, but I don't have any recent discoveries, just more like it's an ongoing, slow, iterative process.
Right.
I had one more question about Mike Flattery.
Yes.
I know you talked about him, and I wasn't able to hear with you. Were able to ascertain what possessed Boston to hire him. I know he's Boston native, probably playing in amateur circles, but somebody must have been tipped off about him. Maybe Tim Murnane, and that might have led to his signing. And he's a very, very interesting guy, very interesting career, and I've never been able to find out a whole lot about him.
Yes,
but he really, really was fascinating to me. And
I'm happy to talk about Mike Slattery. So he was a 17-year-old that was signed by Boston to play from the Boston Satellites, and he hasn't played in over 100 games he's one of the worst players in the Union Association, like just by WAR and all that sort of stuff. He couldn't hit at all, but he's 6'2", he was 200 pounds. He was this really athletic guy. I found a guy with the same initials and last name who was like a sprinter in Boston, so I'm not sure if it's the same guy, but I'm getting the sense he was probably a very good athlete. And then he ends up going to have a pretty extensive major league career, like later on, once he's in his 20s, like with the New York Giants and stuff. But yeah, I think he's just a very good athlete. And Boston, because the Boston Unions joined the Union Association on March 17th, 1884, and the first game was April 17th, 1884. They had a month to get together players. So they basically signed a mix of old Boston guys who were out of the league and then amateurs from the Sandlots. And so Slattery was just one of those guys. I think he was just a really good athlete who, same sort of thing with Tommy McCarthy, who ends up joining the club later. And he ended up being the only Union Association player in the Hall of Fame. He signed as a 20-year-old, but he was, I think, very fast and very athletic, and like whatever talent he showed on the field, people saw something in his athletic ability. Kind of almost the same as you have 5-tool guys today who just have the athletic gifts, but don't necessarily show it on the field, but they get opportunities because of just how gifted they are athletically. So I think Slattery was probably in that category.
Good. Other questions for Justin?
Hi, this is Jim Smith in San Diego. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be able to join in on this. I'm by phone only this morning. Interesting morning. But Justin, thank you for your presentation. My interest goes back to Mr. Moore back in the 80s when I first joined SABR and did a piece called Bowing Out on Top for players who hit 300 in their final major league season.
Yeah.
And that was it. And so with that, what can you say about the caliber of play in the Union Association? I know that's a very subjective issue, but compared to the, the National League, the American Association, what can you say about the caliber of play, since they were pretty much scrounging to find people to play? How does that work?
So yeah, that's a good question. That's kind of the most common question. Again, is about the league quality and stuff like that. I mean, I think it's indisputably probably the weakest of any major league that has that status. The league was very top heavy. So the two top teams in the league, St. Louis and Cincinnati, were both actually pretty strong teams, and the rest of the league was kind of like pretty all over the place. Every team had some major league talent, but not much. And so for a guy like Henry Miller to hit 336, he was 22. I mean, I think it suggests he had some talent. But there's another guy who you can compare him with, is Buster Hoover, who played for the Philadelphia Keystones. He hit, I think, 364 as a rookie, and a 21-year-old in the league. He joins the Phillies, and then he hits under 200, and then he ends up being kind of almost like a quadruple A player, where he does really well in the high-level minors, but when he gets a major league chance, he is very good. And so I think the 336 batting average is like kind of a bit of a misnomer, in the sense that it's hard to say whether he would be like a major league quality player. And it's important to distinguish too that there wasn't this strict delineation between major leagues and minor leagues in 1884. It was just kind of like all these leagues are kind of like doing their thing. And for a player, you're not necessarily, the National League and American Association both have that status as the best leagues in the country. That's not undisputed, but there's not quite the same thing like you have nowadays, where like minor leagues, major leagues, and like every player is trying to get to the major leagues. Here it's just any player, like the Northwestern League played better salaries in some cases than the National League and the American Association, and they were a minor league. And so you have, players would just go over the job was, what the salary was. And so Moore, I think he was a pretty talented player, but obviously went back to California and spent most of his career there. And so I would just venture that the Union Association is the weakest of any kind of major league that has that status, but nonetheless, it's still part of the fabric and tapestry. And there's certain players who were good in the Union Association who are also good in the rest of the major leagues as well. So it's not strictly like if they were good there, they were terrible elsewhere. It's like it's a case by case thing.
No, that makes really good sense. Really does. Could I ask one other question? Is that okay?
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, very simply. Another piece I did back when was on people who appeared in 4 major leagues.
Yeah.
And or who are active, and the name of Tom Loftus comes up as a manager. Does that name ring a bell?
Yeah. So he was managing the Milwaukee club when they joined the Union Association. So Milwaukee was in the Northwestern League, and then they joined the Union Association once the Northwestern League folds in September. And so he ends up being the manager there. He's a really influential figure in kind of Western baseball. He was on the 1879 Dubuque Red Stockings, which was kind of the first great club in the West. They're managed by Ted Sullivan, and that's where Charlie Comiskey comes from. That's where Old House Radbourne comes from, and he was on that club. And then he later goes on to be influential in the formation of, like the Western League, which becomes the American League, and like he's involved in a lot of stuff. And I think the reason he's not better known is I think he died around 1910, and he is still fairly young.
That's
so
right.
He never had that. Like he never got to be like the old statesman, but he was really influential in like baseball, especially in the Western United States.
That's great, and that's my impression, and I appreciate your confirming that. He's just been a fascinating character to me for a good while.
Definitely.
So hey, thanks so much. Look forward to the book.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Justin. That was
my pleasure.
was excellent.
Yes, thank you for me too, Barry. I really
Yeah.
appreciate
Dave
it.
says thank you.
Yes. It's
you're
nice talking to you, Dave. You're one of my heroes and inspirations for this book. So thank you.
Okay, good. We're going to take a quick trivia break and then bring on Dan Taylor.
Right. Well, I have to log off, but it was nice meeting everyone, and thank you for having me in this. I
Great job.
really appreciate it.
That was
Thank
great.
you.
Okay,
And
wonderful.
if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. So thanks.
Okay, very good.
All right, thank you, Barry. Yeah, I enjoyed that. Well, from what I could hear, but I know he's
Okay.
done a lot of good, really good research.
All right, well, we're going to have a little trivia here. Just a few questions. If you know the answer, go ahead. So which player was chastised by Chasey Stengel for blowing gum bubbles while at his position in the field?
Phil Linz.
It was not Phil Linz. Good guess.
Mickey Mantle.
That is correct. It was Mickey Mantle.
That's
That's
good.
what I was about ready
Out
to
in
say.
center field, blowing bubbles. May 1948, a two-time MVP was described as, he's not the game's most popular man, but he wins.
And what was the question? 1948?
The year was 1948.
Oh, 1948. He doesn't know game's most popular man, but he wins.
Right. He's not the game's most popular man, but he wins. Two-time MVP.
Two-time MVP. That's 1948.
Yeah.
Ted Williams was.
It's not Ted Williams, although that would certainly fit his description, but
Okay, wait a minute.
I'll just throw something out. I don't think I'm gonna be right. Jackie Robinson?
not Jackie. No, he was not a two-time MVP at that
Okay,
point.
I didn't think so.
Hal Newhouser.
It is Hal Newhouser.
Oh, good.
Very good.
Uh,
Very good. That was written about Newhouser. Which famous comedian, part owner of the Cleveland Ball Club, once said, "I like the Mets, but I like baseball too"?
Bob Hope.
Bob Hope.
That is Bob Hope, well-known saying. Very good. Article 1950, is Ruth's record in danger? Featured which two teammates? Year was 1950.
Ralph Kiner, Hank Greenberg.
Uh,
no,
Greenberg was gone by then.
Yeah.
Tigers.
It was not the Tigers.
Oh, Pirates.
Wait a minute, two men.
Two teammates.
50 challenge Ruth's record.
Yeah, this was written in the spring.
Early, must have been early spring.
Yes, it was written during spring training.
Spring
Is
training.
Ruth's record in danger? Because they were wrong.
Oh, man.
Nobody came close in 1950.
Nobody even came close, no.
But these were two teammates. One of them is who you might expect, the other is not.
Johnny Mize was pretty much through.
No, yeah, it wasn't Mize. That would have been a good choice. One of them was Ted Williams,
Vern Stevens.
and the other is Vern Stevens.
Ooh.
Who? How many home runs did Vern Stevens ever hit? I don't,
No, he never even had 40.
Yeah. But in 1950, they thought he might do something. He was a good hitter.
Yeah, he had a good year that year.
Speaking of Ted Williams, in 1954, he said, the 300 hitter has become a vanishing American due to what? Year was 54.
54, due to Ted Williams that being taken away from baseball to
Relief pitching?
No, it wasn't Williams himself. He was talking about in general. Pitching, no, it had nothing to do with pitching.
Shift.
Not the shift, no.
Um,
Damn good guess.
Good guess, yeah. I like that.
I've listened to a baseball podcast and I shouted a trivia answer. I got it wrong.
That's okay. Go ahead. You're welcome here. Why would Williams say the 300 hitter has become a vanishing mirror? Obviously, Williams was hitting 300 every year.
Strike zone had
It wasn't due to the umpires or strike zone.
loaded bats. would now be
Not
discovered.
bats. No, not bats.
No longer.
Not equipment.
Night games?
It is night games.
Ooh, very good.
Excellent game.
Good. Good.
Williams is
Good.
complaining about night games.
Good question.
Okay, which Hall of Famer once said, on D-Day, I was firing rockets?
Bob Feller.
It was not Bob Feller.
Yogi?
It is Yogi.
Oh.
Yogi Berra was there on D-Day,
Yeah.
as was,
Yogi Berra was where on D-Day?
he was in France.
He wasn't in the armed services.
Sure he was.
Hey,
Yeah,
no way.
yes,
Come on. Look at his birthday.
yeah, he was there. Okay, a 1947 article said, here stands baseball's perfect warrior. Who were they talking about in 1947?
Musial.
It is Stan Musial.
Very good.
Excellent. Did you read the article?
No, I was born that year.
Perfect,
So was
perfect
I.
night, isn't it? Perfect night.
Good year to be born. Was Helen Britton?
Owner of the St. Louis Cardinals.
She was the owner of the St. Louis Cardinals. And what else can we say about her?
She was the daughter of one of the Robeson brothers.
Daughter, one of the Robeson brothers, right? She was
Who were
the
the previous owners of the team.
She was the first woman to own a major league team. She owned the
Right.
Cardinals 1911 to 1917. Very good, Dave. Who is Annie Savoy?
The love interest in Bull Durham.
She was the groupie in Bull Durham. Yes, Crash Davis's girlfriend.
Yep.
How about Katie Casey?
Take me out to the ball game.
Exactly. She's the girl in Take Me Out to the Ball Game. You want to sing that?
No.
No. Okay. Who was Lorinda de Roulet?
Who?
Lorinda de Roulet or Roulette. I think it's Roulet.
It's not the real name of the Morgana the Kissing Bandit, was it?
No. If this was her name, she wouldn't have been Morgana.
Worked for the Mets.
Yeah, not only worked for the Mets,
Her mother was, yeah.
she inherited the Mets from when Mrs. Payson died. And she's the first woman to direct day-to-day operations for a major league team. Ran the Mets from 1975 to 1980. Very good. Okay, well, thank you. I will bring on Dan Taylor now. Dan has written a book about Kenny Washington. Let me bring that one up here. Okay, oh, good, Dan, you go ahead.
Kenny, the football player?
Kenny, the football player.
Unfortunately, I gotta go. Otherwise, I'd love to stay with
Okay,
you.
well, thanks, Dave. Dan is an award-winning television sportscaster and currently the television broadcaster for the Fresno Grizzlies. He's a prolific author. Kenny Washington, in the late 1930s, was a football sensation at UCLA. In 1946, he became the Jackie Robinson of football when he joined the Los Angeles Rams.
You're gonna go over about 5 or 6 guys there.
And those who saw him play said baseball was his best sport. So Dan, why don't you, you're going to talk about that in his brief stint with the Los Angeles Angels. And when he was at the center of efforts to integrate baseball. Take it away, Dan.
Thank you, Barry. Thanks for the chance to be here. This has been fascinating and tough to follow up those trivia questions. So the topic is the Almost Jackie, and it is from the book Walking Alone, The Untold Journey of Football Pioneer Kenny Washington. And a lot of times when I ask people if they know who Kenny Washington is, I kind of get this response from people, and it's not surprising. A lot of time has passed, and a lot of people don't realize who he was. And I had to go to a lot of resources to find out myself, one of which was Groucho Marx.
Don't follow football. This is one of the legendary names in the game. Oh, this is Mr. Washington, the first man to ever throw a dollar across the Potomac River. For those.
And Kenny Washington, and we'll just touch briefly on football to put him into context, but there were Hall of Fame players who played against him and watched him play that insisted he's the greatest player that ever played the game. Just a tremendous back. And he could also, what Groucho was alluding to, he could also throw a football 100 yards in the air. Just had an amazing throwing arm. But Washington was a tremendous player in the late 30s at UCLA, their first ever first-team All-American, and the first UCLA athlete in any sport to have his number retired. Many people realize he was a backfield mate with Jackie Robinson in the 1939 season, a year UCLA went undefeated, and that he's known as the Jackie Robinson of the NFL when he joined the Rams in '46, but technically he reintegrated the league. It had been in a 13-year segregation, unwritten segregation policy, and there were black players in the 20s and early 30s, but Washington came along in '46 and reintegrated the National Football League. But what really I found astonishing in my research was, as great as Kenny Washington was on the football field, many people who saw him play insisted he was a far better baseball player. One of which, and his love of baseball came through in this episode of Groucho's You Bet Your Life.
Were you active in other sports besides football when you were in college?
Yes, Groucho, I played baseball. In fact, I believe that truly was my first love.
And he actually, his dad, Edgar Blue Washington, had a couple of stints with all black teams. In 1916, played for Rube Foster's Chicago American Giants. And the very first year that the Negro League was launched, 1920, he was the first baseman on the inaugural Kansas City Monarchs. Played about half a season before he was released. But Kenny and his dad had no relationship. His dad really wasn't in the family much at all. And Washington first came to prominence technically as a baseball player. In the spring of 1934, he was a sophomore at Lincoln High School there in Los Angeles. And Lincoln and Fremont High were battling for the city title. And for Fremont High, that was no big deal because they were a perennial baseball power. But for Lincoln, it was really unique. And Fremont that season, both these teams that season were powered by 15-year-old sophomores. In Fremont's case, it was an infielder by the name of Bob Dorr. In Lincoln's case, it was their shortstop, Kenny Washington. And these two dueled for the batting title. Dorr won it. Washington won the home run title. He was quite a power hitter. There was no champion crowned because a polio outbreak hit Los Angeles with a couple of weeks to go in the season, and all public gatherings were halted, and the high school baseball season came to a stop. And as we all know, when you're putting Kenny's abilities into context, Bob Dorr went from Fremont High that sophomore year. He left school after that year. Just a couple of weeks after the baseball season concluded, he signed with the Hollywood Stars. A couple of years later, was purchased by the Red Sox, and after a tremendous big league career, is in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Kenny Washington played one season of baseball at UCLA. That was his sophomore year. He was their shortstop, the 1938 season. A teammate, Al Martell, said, "I'd never seen an arm like that on any ball player, like a howitzer." Washington was the first African-American to play baseball at UCLA. He hit .409. He was second in the league. That was .409 in league games. And he was the all-conference shortstop. Stanford, in the game at Sunken Diamond, which is where they still play their games at Stanford, Washington hit what for decades is considered to be the longest home run ever hit out of that ballpark. It was an opposite field shot. At that time, the fence was 450 to right center, and outfielders, it cleared the fence. Outfielders said it was still rising and disappeared into the trees. Prescott Sullivan of the San Francisco Examiner wrote of Washington that spring, leading hitter, best shortstop in the college baseball out our way is Kenny Washington of UCLA. Coaches of other teams say he has major league ability, but big league scouts aren't interested in him. Washington is a Negro. Another interesting comparison, Sam Chapman was the star player at University of California that 1938 season. And every time UCLA and Cal met, the game got added attention because Washington and Chapman were also the best players on their respective football teams, in addition to being the best players on their respective baseball teams. Well, Washington was
an interesting conference
that year, and Chapman,
the LA chapter of SABR, Allan Roth chapter.
Chapman hit 340 that year and was 14th in the league in hitting. Yet right at the end of the season, Chapman was signed by Connie Mack's Philadelphia A's, stepped right into their starting outfield, and never spent a day in the minor leagues. Kenny and Jackie Robinson, there's been a lot written about the two of them. And when it comes to baseball, there's been a lot of inaccuracies that I felt were important in the book to set the record straight. A lot of things have been published that they were baseball teammates. That's not true. Kenny only played his sophomore year. He had work commitments as a junior, and he actually took money to play in some football all-star games that made him a professional, so he did not play baseball as a senior. Jackie only played in his junior year when he transferred in from Pasadena City College, and then in his senior year, he left school at the end of the football season to take a job to help support his mother. Interesting comparison, for the full 1938 season, Kenny hit .397. For his full 1940 season, Jackie hit .097, and people who have followed Jackie's life and career closely pretty strongly agree that baseball, ironically, was the worst of the four sports he competed in at UCLA. Kenny Washington, for all of his great football success, insisted later in his life that his greatest thrill actually happened on the diamond in this ballpark. Of course, that's Wrigley Field. And in the 20s and 30s and 40s, there was a tremendous winter baseball league in Southern California, in Los Angeles. And they would launch this league with an exhibition game in Wrigley Field. And they would match an all-black team with an all-white team. And they aggressively recruited Negro League players to come and play in this winter league. And they also, the white players it was a makeup of big league players, American League players, National League players, Pacific Coast League players. And they like to bring in a headliner every year to be kind of the showpiece of this exhibition game that would introduce the LA Winter Professional Baseball League. And what they liked to do was bring in a big name major league player. One year it was Dizzy Dean came out one year. They had in 1939, Bob Feller came in 41, both Ted Williams and Jimmy Fox came. And in 1942, they invited Satchel Paige to be the headliner. But just days before the game was to be played, Satchel withdrew. He had pitched in every single game in the Negro World Series, and he's told the organizers that he was very tired and that his arm was sore. So they were scrambling to find a headliner, and they reached out to Kenny Washington. Kenny Washington, during the war years, became a cop on the LAPD force, and he had not played any baseball since '38 at this particular point. And Washington agreed to play. They plugged him into the three-hole in the lineup for the Royal Colored Giants, was what they called the all-black team. And he played second base. And the pitcher for the all-white team was Larry French of the Brooklyn Dodgers. He had gone 14-5 that season, pitched 2 scoreless innings in the All-Star game. And when Washington came up in the bottom of the first inning with 2 outs, he promptly sent a Larry French pitch to the back row of the right center field bleachers for a home run. And Washington called this his greatest thrill in sports. Rod Dato was a participant in that game, and he said Washington could really slug the ball. French just stood there shaking his head. Washington was then invited to continue during the season and play for the Royal Colored Giants during the Winter League to work it around his schedule with the LAPD. And late in the season, Cool Papa Bell played this winter. Oscar Charleston played this particular winter. They had some really, really good players from the Negro Leagues that were involved in the league. And the LA Sentinel, in an article very late in the Winter League season, called Washington the best hitter in the league. there were three separate times when Washington was involved in efforts to integrate baseball, and they ranged from the very innocent to pretty serious efforts. The innocent one came in 1940, just maybe 3 or 4 weeks after Washington played his last football game at UCLA. Larry McPhail, the GM of the Brooklyn Dodgers, loved to come out every January for the opening of the horse racing season at Santa Anita. He would get with some of his baseball buddies who lived in LA, guys like Fred Haney, and they would hobnob with the movie stars at the horse races. Dave Farrell, a sports writer, seized on this and turned his column one day into an open letter to McPhail. And he started off buttering him up. I'm writing you this letter because I consider you far and away the most brilliant mogul. And then in the letter, he made a pitch for Kenny Washington. He said, "You've been looking for a heavy-hitting outfielder. Let me tell you about Kenny. You certainly can use him." And then he went on to really press McPhail to integrate. Baseball needs new vitality, new faces. Let's stop being ostriches and face a few facts. How about being just plain sensible? Well, that got no response. And then in 1943, of course, America was at war. You had big names like Bob Feller and Hank Greenberg that were serving our country, but so too were over 1,400 minor league players, and entire minor leagues went on hiatus or shut down permanently because they couldn't find players. Well, Pacific Coast League teams were struggling as well, and you had teams like the San Francisco Seals, the Hollywood Stars, the LA Angels that were on the verge of spring training and only able to sign maybe 13, 14, 17 players. And so there were two sports editors of black papers in Los Angeles, the Eagle and the Sentinel, and they approached the Stars and they approached Pants Rowland, who ran the LA Angels. And they said, "We've got a solution for you, Kenny Washington." And they also strongly pitched Chet Brewer. And they said they could give the two clubs a list of all the Negro League players who were working at Lockheed and other aircraft plants and also munitions factories in the area. And Pants Rowland said he would give Kenny Washington a shot, and he would also give Chet Brewer a shot. And then as spring training drew close, nothing came about. No word, no invitation. And the sports editors went back to Rowland, and Rowland said he had talked to Bill Sweeney, his manager. Sweeney didn't want any part of it. He said it would disrupt his team, and the opportunity was lost. And the supervisors there in Los Angeles jumped on this, and they really urged baseball to change its ways. And they pointed out that the Pacific Coast League was probably the ideal league to integrate. Washington and Robinson, when they played football at UCLA, did not have problems. UCLA had no problems having black players, and with the hotels they stayed in, which were in pretty much Pacific Coast League markets, the opposing Pacific Coast Conference schools. And they talked about Washington being the ideal guy to integrate baseball. And the supervisors unanimously voted a resolution deploring the discrimination and asking baseball to put an end to it. In 1945, it finally happened. That's when, at the direction of Branch Rickey, the Dodgers' top farm team, the Montreal Royals, signed Jackie Robinson. And Rickey had declared that Jackie was not going to be the only one that would play at 1946 season at Montreal. He was going to sign a second black player. And Jackie quickly lobbied for Kenny Washington. And he told the New York Daily News that Kenny was going to make his first serious crack at baseball next year. And Wendell Smith, the iconic sports editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, was a confidant of Rickey's. And he sent him this letter just a few weeks after Robinson's signing. It reminded him that he had pledged to sign a second black player. And Wendell Smith wrote, "I am suggesting very seriously that you consider Kenny Washington. I understand he is much better than Robinson." What happened? Why did this not come about? Well, it was the last week of January when Washington was finally contacted by anyone with the Dodgers. And he said, "I answered no because I had other plans." What were those other plans? Well, about 10, 12 days earlier is when the Rams announced they were leaving Cleveland and moving to Los Angeles. And their general manager came out, and one of the first things he did on arriving in Los Angeles was to get Kenny Washington to agree to sign a contract with the Rams. They wanted to keep it a secret until March, when the staff would arrive in Los Angeles and they would officially announce it. And in fact, the Rams' very first news conference in Los Angeles was announcing the signing of Kenny Washington. And as Washington said years later, "I've always been a man of my word. I had given the Rams my word. And as much as I wanted to play baseball, I couldn't go back on it." So he went on with his football career. In 1946, he was a rookie with the Rams. And late in that season, in October, Leo Durocher arrived in Los Angeles, and he told a sports writer for the Examiner that the Dodgers were going to sign Kenny Washington and that he was going to play in Montreal in 47 and then get a shot to join the Dodgers in 48. And this persisted for several weeks. It showed up in papers all around the country that the signing was going to happen any day, that he would play the 47 season at Montreal. And as spring training arrived and still nothing had happened, Durocher was pressed about it, and he acknowledged, his quote in several of the papers was, his knee was on the bum. Well, Dodger scouts had really watched Washington, and he had suffered a knee injury and had major surgery prior to training camp in 46 and did not play well in 46. And the Dodgers were kind of scared off by that and elected not to sign him. When Washington retired from football at the end of the 1948 season, baseball immediately came back into the picture, and Bing Crosby was all over him. At that time, he owned a portion of the Pittsburgh Pirates, and Crosby invited Washington to join the team for spring training. The San Diego Padres also offered a Washington contract for the 1949 season. Of course, in 48, they had integrated the Coast League with John Ritchie, and their 49 team was going to have Minnie Minoso and Luke Easter. And Washington, unfortunately, turned both opportunities down because he had made, once again, prior commitments. And those commitments were to act. He was in demand in Hollywood. In his career, he acted in about 12 movies, but he had signed to do 3 films in 1949. The first, he acted opposite Burt Lancaster in Rope of Sand. He played the role of a doctor in a movie called Pinky that was very controversial. The female stars in it were both nominated for Academy Awards. And this movie it involved an interracial love story, and the film was banned in several southern counties. And it ended up becoming a Supreme Court case in which the film won. And then he also had a very, very brief speaking part in the Jackie Robinson story, the third and final film that he did that year. And kind of a funny aside, Jackie was asked about, since he was going to play himself in this film, if he was nervous or worried or scared. And Jackie laughed to the reporter and said, "Why should I be worried? If Kenny can act, anybody can act." But when he finished that, Kenny announced that he was dedicated to playing baseball. He said, "I'm going to play professional baseball." And just prior to spring training in 1950, Leo Durocher brought him into the New York Giants, and the Giants signed Kenny Washington. And it was a big, big story around the country, particularly in Black newspapers, this football sensation trying to make the jump to professional baseball. And he got off to a tremendous start, but he had major obstacles. At that time, he was 31 years old. He was the oldest rookie in any spring training camp. He was coming off 5 knee surgeries, and knee surgeries then were not the type of procedure that they are now. They were very, very intricate. Plus, he had not played any competitive baseball in 5 years. During the war years, the police department created a team. He was the star. They played a lot of military bases, other police departments. And he hadn't played since he left the police department in 1944. The Giants' situation, 7 of their 8 positions were set. The only open job was right field. And Durocher had 8 outfielders competing for 7 outfield spots. So Kenny was pushed into a battle with Monty Irvin and Don Mueller for the right field job. And he came out and in a couple of inter-squad games, hit some loud, long home runs that really impressed Durocher. But once they got into spring training, and he was the starting right fielder in their exhibition opener with Cleveland in Tucson. And that game had 7 black starters. They got a lot of national notoriety. People raised the question of whether that was the most black players that had ever been starters in a single big league game at that point. But he struggled with the curve. He'd been away from the game a while. He was rusty. Durocher assigned him to the Giants' B team. They were training in Arizona, and most of the B team's games were against Pacific Coast League teams, and Washington had hits in just about every single game. They wrapped up with a tour of California. The B team played USC. Washington that afternoon hit a grand slam and a 2-run triple. And then after the game, Durocher sat him down and told him that he was not going to make the team. And Durocher said to the sports writers, "Make no mistake about it, Kenny can really wrap that ball. Nobody has worked any harder in camp than Kenny. I was disappointed in his throwing. Football must have tightened up his arm and shoulder muscles." And a scout who had been watching the Giants and watching him, didn't want his name used, was quoted in the Times saying, "All those years in football took too much out of him." Washington was offered a chance. The Giants wanted to put him at their Jersey City farm team. He declined. He had a young family, said he was going to play in the minors. He wanted it to be on the West Coast. DeRocher made strong recommendations to Coast League people that he knew. And on the night before opening day of the 1950 season, the LA Angels signed Kenny Washington. He began the season as a pinch hitter. The first 2.5 weeks of the season, he was strictly used by Don Kelly as a pinch hitter. And then Kelly was very unhappy with the play of their third baseman. And he made Washington his third baseman. And in the third game he played, he was badly spiked on a play at third base, had to sit out. He had not been hitting the ball well. And the Angels talked to him about going to a lower level of the minor leagues when he was able to play again, just to kind of knock the rust off, get his swing together. And Washington, he knew what it meant and felt strongly that he'd had his chance, his time had passed, so he elected to retire from playing in professional sports. After sports, he was a business executive. He was vice president of Young's Market, the wholesale liquor industry. Later was poached by a top national liquor distributor as their vice president. In 1956, he was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame, the National Football Foundation Hall of Fame. And when the Dodgers came west in 58, Walter O'Malley recruited him to be an advisor to help their sales, to try and sell tickets into the Black community. And the scouting department also put him to work to help them identify talent and to help them. And in one way they did, as you recall, in 64, Willie Crawford was one of the most coveted high school players in the country. The Dodgers got him, and the Dodgers got him for far less than what a couple of other clubs were offering him. And Crawford's family shared with the media that Kenny Washington was the reason he went to the Dodgers, that Washington built up this relationship with him, had the family to the stadium club and to games many times, and that it was really Kenny Washington's work that helped the Dodgers to get Willie Crawford. Washington died in 1971 of a very rare and incurable heart and lung disease. He'd been in hospitals most of the last 2 years of his life. He was just 52 years old at the time of his death. This plaque is in the peristyle end of the Los Angeles Coliseum. It reads, "An All-American for all America." And on his passing, his old UCLA teammate Al Martell said, "Where Washington could have gone in pro baseball is something to contemplate. He was definitely a victim of baseball's color line." So thanks for the opportunity to share that story and information. And Barry, if there's time for questions, I'm open to it, but whatever works.
Yeah, we have plenty of time for questions, so please.
Yeah, I have a question. I recently read your book and I thought it was
Thank you,
outstanding. I really enjoyed it. The one question that I had was, in the early 40s, before he signed with the Rams, he played basically minor league football. Did he ever consider playing in the Negro Leagues during that time?
Don, that's a great question. There were probably half a dozen burning questions that I felt were important to this book that I really struggled to find the answers to. That being one of them. I reached out to a lot of historians that I really didn't get any response from. I was disappointed in that. I think he was probably scouted because his senior year of high school, there were 3 players at a rival high school who all went on and the next year played in the Negro Leagues. And that LA Winter League, a lot of Negro League players chose to winter in Southern California. And some of them were managers. And I believe because it was the Baltimore Elite Giants that signed 2 of these 3 players out of Reese High School in Los Angeles, and the Elite Giants manager played in the LA Winter League, I have to believe that he got out and looked at talent and had some involvement. So I don't have anything concrete, Don, that tells me yes, but I have to believe it based on these other guys coming out of Reese High School and playing in the Negro Leagues. And he always seemed to be college oriented. He was raised by his grandmother. The father figure was his uncle, who was a member of the LA Police Department, and the uncle really was pushing him to college. So I think that even if he was approached with opportunities, the sense I got, I talked to his daughter, his grandsons, and they have no knowledge. They said he never spoke of that. A funny aside to that, Don, a story you and everybody else might laugh at, but his daughter was terrific, but she was very upfront admitting to me that she'd come into the family, she was adopted, she came into the family very late after Kenny had finished playing. And so she said, to me, he was just daddy. And I didn't know anything about his sports background. And she said, I came home from junior high school one day and he's sitting at our kitchen table talking to Willie Mays. And she said, listening to them talk, I thought, my God, my daddy must have been somebody. And she said she really tried to get stories out of him at that point, but it wasn't long after that he became very ill and passed away. So yeah, but that was one of the great frustrations I had, Don, was trying to find that out.
Dan, I have a question.
Yes.
I remember the UCLA basketball teams in the 60s of Wooden. I think their first two championships, there's a Kenny Washington that played. Was that his son?
No, that was a player from North Carolina, no relation at all. Kenny's son, Kenny Jr., interesting story. He was a very good high school player at Dorsey High in Los Angeles, and good baseball and football player. Anytime anybody tried to give him his dad's number 13, he wanted no part of it. He wanted to create his own reputation. When it came time to go to college, he had a lot of offers. He chose to go to UCLA's arch rival, USC, and instead of football, play baseball. He was a star left fielder for Dato on the 63 national championship team. He was the left fielder and was named to the All-College World Series team and was signed by the Dodgers. He spent 5 or 6 seasons getting to AAA in their organization, and then played half of a season in Japan at the end of his baseball career, I think in 1970.
Good. Other questions?
How long have you been an announcer for the Fresno Grizzlies?
Started in 19 when they were just in their AAA season with the Washington Nationals. And then the last 2 seasons since they've been back in the California League and affiliated with the Rockies. And it's been fun because I got to tell you, the Rockies, they may be terrible at the big league level, but I'd say in 25, watch out. I mean, we've all been amazed at the talent that they've got coming through. In fact, 6 guys who've been here in low A ball over the last 2 years are now on major league roster, 40-man rosters, which is kind of unheard of to make that jump.
And the California League is a low A ball now?
It's now low A, correct.
Okay. By the way, I grew up in Fresno.
Oh, terrific. Terrific.
Dan, what's your next book?
Next book will be out in April. It is called Baseball at the Abyss. And it is about the 1926 scandal in which Ty Cobb was kicked out of baseball by Ban Johnson. And then the work behind the scenes by Christy Walsh, Babe Ruth's manager, to get Ruth fit, focused, and to have his greatest season ever in 1927, which many sports writers of the day said it rescued the game from the reputation from the winter scandal. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, sounds interesting. That's very good. Okay, any other questions for Dan? I can open it up. Any good and welfare? Anybody want to share anything? Anything you're working on? Any interesting discoveries? Nobody's working.
Wow, Marlene and Don, I'm shocked. You guys are always on top of great stuff.
Well, Tony's comment, fantastic presentation. Thank you.
Very kind. Thank you.
I think we all feel that way.
If I can't jump in, I am actually working on something, which is why I'm interested in talking to Dan some more. I'm working on a book about how the Chicago Cubs and White Sox integrated their teams in the 1940s and 50s. And I included the minor league teams as well, because there's some really interesting stories as well. And it's really a fascinating subject. I've done most of the research and contacted actually a lot of friends and family members of some of the early players. A lot of them played in California. So it's a really interesting project, and hoping to wrap it up sometime next year.
That'd be great.
Is Gene Baker in that book?
Yeah, Baker is a major character in the book, because he was one of the first Black players signed by the Cubs, and he actually played with the Angels for 4 years. And he was there so long, he had a consecutive game record for playing with the Angels. And it was really kind of a scandal at the time that the Cubs didn't bring him up, because most people who knew baseball thought that Baker was ready for the major leagues probably in 1950, certainly as early as 1951. But they did not bring him up until late in the 1953 season. And they brought him up at the same time as Banks. And some people actually felt that they didn't bring Baker up because they needed another black player for him to be a roommate with. You know, that was actually a consideration at the time, but really a lot of people were outraged that it took Baker so long to reach the major leagues.
I know some people that were Angel fans at the time that watched and were big fans of Baker. So I can connect you with those guys, Don. Happy to help you in any way you need.
I appreciate that.
Okay, Tom Larwin, I want to thank for promoting this among the San Diego folks. Anybody else want to just jump in?
Dan, that was a great presentation.
Well, thank you.
I had never heard of Kenny Washington in any aspect before an hour ago. It was terrific.
You had a Rodney face there.
I am currently working, I got about 500 words into it, a piece for the 19th Century newsletter. The players Ted Brittenstein and Pink Hawley are famous names to 19th century people, but most other baseball fans never heard of them. And they both have excellent SABR biographies written about them in our annals. However, the writers of those biographies failed to do one thing, and that is mention the other player's name in the biography of the other player. They made no connection of these two players. And there is a great connection of these players. So I am making the connection for the 19th century newsletter.
Very good. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thanks to our presenters.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Barry. This was fun.
Yeah.
Happy holidays.
Yeah, have a
Thank
good
you.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays.
See you later.